It's at 3:30, sorry, I got muted there. And it focuses on leadership development in the P3 space. Christy Cowers has put together an excellent panel that's going to discuss how elementary principals can ensure instructional quality to leverage the benefits of pre-K by looking at various strategies and reflecting on the strengths and challenges of each. So I'm going to hop off and pass it to Christy to get this started.
Great, thank you, Matt, and thank you to all of you who have joined to listen in on this last session. I am very excited to introduce the panel of folks we've brought together. I count them as good colleagues. We've all worked together for quite some time as we share similar priorities and values and really thinking about leadership development on behalf of pre-K through third grade work. As Matt suggested, this is really focusing on leadership development programs, and the folks that have been invited to participate have really taken a state level approach to thinking about providing these kinds of opportunities. And what we have, what my center has done is actually looked at a variety of P3 leadership programs around the country. The states that are highlighted here have programs in place either at the state level or at the local level. So you can see there is a number of them that exist. We will be coming out with a report that highlights the differences in these programs and approaches later this fall. For this panel though, we have brought together examples of different approaches to thinking about how states can support this work. The first approach that we're going to be hearing about is an SEA-led effort. This is the Minnesota Department of Education, and I'm pleased to have Bobby Burnham, who is the Assistant Commissioner for the Office of Teaching and Learning from Minnesota Department of Education, MDE, and her colleague Mike Brown, who is an education specialist, who has actually been working in this P3 space for nearly a decade now. The second approach is really a legislative approach, and this is going to be represented by Erica Hunt, who is a researcher at the Center for the Study of Education Policy at Illinois State, and has been, Erica, who has been a key proponent and pusher of legislative changes to Illinois' principal preparation statutes. So she'll be talking about a legislative approach. The third approach is going to include the National Association of Elementary School Principals, who has designed a leadership program that is then offered in collaboration with state agencies. And so NAESP will be represented today by Gracie Branch, who is the Associate Executive Director for Professional Learning at NAESP. And she's going to be sharing her time with Jean Allen from the state of Alabama. Jean is the Innovative Projects and Assessment Administrator at the Alabama Department of Early Childhood Education. And then the fourth approach that we're going to be briefly touching on is when an IHE, or an institution of higher ed, offers a leadership program. I am going to speak to that as I led a program in Washington State for 4 years, and we are designing one out of the University of Colorado, Denver right now. We're going to try to make this as engaging and round robin as possible. We have a number of questions that we're going to circle through so that we can hear from each program one at a time, so that we can do some comparing and contrasting of these state level approaches. So I'm going to ask as we begin that each program do a very brief overview of what your program is, sort of what its highlights are, what was the genesis of your program, how did it come to be anchored where it is, and what kinds of advantages or disadvantages might you see to having the administrative home that you do have. Bobby and Mike, I'm going to ask Minnesota to take this question first.
Thanks, Christy. I'm going to tackle this first question. Thank you, Christy, and the Center and NGA and Rolf for organizing this event. We're always happy to share and learn from everyone in this great space. Minnesota's program has really evolved over the last 10 to 12 years. You know, in the 8 years we spent in Reading First doing a K-3 model really kind of planted some deep seeds around showing the state what an aligned pre-K-3 approach could do. So we really started and had lots of lessons learned. As you well know, Christy, you've been a part of it pretty much from day one. And one of those lessons learned was we started back in 2011 and it lived in the Division of Early Learning Services at MDE. And from the start, we believed aligning early childhood with K-12 was critical. And the fact that we have worked on P3 professional development, both for the field and in our own professional development and almost especially internally at MDE for almost 10 years, demonstrates really a strong commitment, you know, not only by our agency, but, you know, the executive team and the governor's office as well. So this is an advantage because the field has really come to expect us to offer P3 professional development opportunities, and it's not uncommon for districts to ask us to keep pushing them in this work and have it be the focus of many of our cross-agency efforts. And, you know, when speaking about disadvantages, I think to begin with, you know, we had many professional development offerings, and we really realized that we needed to identify a true district level leader in this work. So the elementary principals became our core focus for ensuring that we had them be the leaders of this work. Another area of challenge would be this living in the Division of Early Learning Services and not being seen across the agency as a priority for the entire agency. So that work has been ongoing. Another disadvantage in terms of how much time and resources we can dedicate to the work is that we do not have staff who are specifically assigned to the focus solely on P3. But nevertheless, we are continuing to grow in this area. In my new role on the executive team, it really places this P3 work in a much elevated area of focus for strategic planning, not only for the agency, but across agencies as well.
Great, thank you.
And that's our story for question 1.
Great, thank you, Bobby. Erica, I'm going to ask you to give a little bit of context on Illinois' efforts. Would you like your slide up for this one?
Yes, please. I have one slide I'm going to refer to for each of my responses because this slide captures some of the writings that have been done on our work where you can get more information about this. But our work in Illinois is legislation that was passed in 2011 that redesigned all principal preparation programs in the state. The genesis for this was actually, it came out of the 2005 Art Levine report out of Teachers College of Columbia that did a scathing review, did a national review of principal preparation programs and did a scathing critique on the quality of principal preparation programs. So based on that national report, our Board of Higher Ed and State Board partnered with the Center for the Study of Education Policy to do our own kind of Illinois review. And we were working through a task force, which then led to further task force in this work, looking at the quality of our principal preparation programs in Illinois, at which time then we were approached by the McCormick Foundation, which was hearing from the field more and more that school leaders are the critical lever to that transition or that articulation from early childhood to K-12. And that they were either, could be the biggest success factor or be the most problematic in that transition. And because of that, there was a real fear of fade out and not articulating, not clear, articulated, seamless learning once they transitioned onto the next system. So they asked the Center for the Study of Education Policy to commission another task force that brought together early childhood and K-12 and higher ed folks discussing what is the role of school leaders with this bridge. So that work transitioned to the work we were already doing with redesigning the principal preparation programs. And that's how Illinois' new statewide requirements are P12 focused. So what that means in Illinois is that anybody who goes through a principal preparation program has to get, there's content threaded throughout with early childhood, ELL and special ed, as well as we have standards aligned with competencies in early childhood, special ed and ELL, and they have to have actual experiences at all levels of education during their clinical experiences. So that's kind of the impetus of how this all started. And I do want to say, although we took a legislative approach, that was not our first priority, our first thing we wanted to do. We first tried to do collaboration with universities to increase their standards and programs together, and found that they couldn't do that because of the competitive nature of universities, that if one raised the quality, the other would recruit those students, those candidates. It just, we had to do a lot more educating on why quality is important. The second approach was then as district as consumer, and we tried to get the districts to then take positions and put pressure on universities to be preparing the kind of candidates they needed. And we struggled with that because districts were afraid to burn bridges or be too candid about what universities were and were not doing. The only superintendent at that time who would be very vocal was Arnie Duncan at CPS, who was always a strong advocate of our work. And then the third approach, we had to do the legislative. We tried all of those. And so when you see, we have a book right here, Reforming Principal Preparation at the State Level, that captures the whole process. And you can see it took 5 years because we were trying other approaches before we had to do the legislative, which was, I think, the right thing we did, and is what has sustained our work.
Great. Thank you, Erica. And we'll be able to come back and hear more on that. So now let's quickly hear about NAESP and Alabama's reason for being and how you've landed on the genesis of your efforts.
Thank you, Christy.
Yeah, go ahead, Gracie.
Jeannie Allen of Alabama and I are going to share the spotlight with this, but originally NAESP began its work in early childhood in 2005, and over the years we've begun now to broaden our perspective and encourage principals to think not just birth to age 5, but pre-K through 3rd grade. And so our work with the NAESP Pre-K Leadership Academy has that focus on guiding principals in their work in leading schools to have quality early childhood programs in their schools and to have that continuum from pre-K through 3rd grade. And we found great success in partnership with state associations and early childhood departments of education. So Jeannie, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. So we began the work in P3 around 2017 when we received the Kellogg grant, and that's what we used as our seed money to get our P3 program going. And one of the main things we knew we needed was a leadership academy. And much of that came out of the knowledge that many of our pre-Ks had already begun being in some of the school systems. And we already knew that early childhood leadership was something that we had to have in place to have a successful early learning continuum. And so the reason it landed at CLASS, which in Alabama, that's the Council for Leaders in Alabama Schools, is because that's where principals and most of the school leadership go for their PLUs. So it became a partnership that CLASS receives a grant from our department to partner with NAESP to put out this curriculum for leaders in Alabama. So one of the strong advantages, like I said, is that it is building upon the success of our pre-K, and it is expanding that early learning continuum thought because many of these pre-Ks are already in this school setting. And the good thing is, another advantage is that it's spreading out beyond just principals. And so when you apply the principles in P3, so when you apply to have a P3 grant, which is through our department, one of the requirements is that you must apply to the Leadership Academy. But what we know is that there's a seating limit of 25 people, that's the capacity. But what we've known is that it's many more than just those in the P3 pilot that we have that are applying to be part of this. And so it's really taken life of its own. And that's been the advantage of us moving it through, having the vehicle of class being the vehicle of how it's provided.
Great. Thank you, Gracie and Jean. And then I want to just quickly talk about the IHE approach, which is to have a major university in the state design and offer the program itself. What we found in both Washington and here in Colorado is that via both focus groups and surveys, what we continually hear from principals and other administrators in school districts is that they are drowning in professional learning opportunities. And what they most want is for it to count towards something. And so that is why we have taken the approach to think about designing a P3 leadership program that both provides content in child development, in what high quality instruction looks like across the pre-K through 3rd grade span, in leadership approaches, actually taking the leadership side of P3 seriously. So providing both the content, but then embedding them in a credit-bearing course of study so that participants can earn graduate credit towards either a master's degree or a doctoral degree, depending on where they are, and or be able to use those credits towards any kind of state-sanctioned professional pathway. Most principals have to have ongoing professional development. And so our real impetus for building programs inside higher ed was that very fact, is that it really could provide an extra incentive for participants. In addition, we also know that higher ed usually tends to be a place where principals and others recognize that they can receive high quality teaching and learning. Higher ed hopefully has a really great reputation for preparing individuals either through degree pathways or for ongoing professional learning. So that was sort of the strategy behind a higher ed approach. Okay, we're going to now move toward our second question, which is, what's the theory of change behind your approach? In other words, you designed a program, and as we heard in the last session, the ultimate impetus is to change children's learning opportunities. What was the theory of change? How did you think about getting from a program to actually changing children's experiences? And Erica, I'm going to let you answer this question first.
Okay. Well, the theory of change behind our principal preparation legislation was really the district as consumer and making sure that principal preparation programs were preparing the kind of candidates that principals needed that could hit the ground running. But the theory of change of integrating early learning into this was more from a systems perspective, using values of quality and efficiency, and that our state and our districts are investing a lot of money into early childhood. And if those gains are not sustained at the next level, then we're really losing out economically on that investment, as well as experiencing fade out in learning outcomes that need to be made up. So that's been a lot of the focus of the preparation programs, is trying to get them to see it from a systems perspective, and how do we get leaders at all levels to understand that. Now with our principal preparation programs by legislation and the rules, it's not just elementary school principals that have to get experiences in early learning, it's high school principals as well. And they're finding, the feedback we're receiving from them is they come back and it's such an enlightening experience for them. And they realize how high the standards are at early learning. And then that makes them feel like if they can be doing that at that young age, then we need to be pushing our students more at the high school level. So that whole systems perspective is really valuable. And I do think that's helping children, because if we're trying to design these systems from that student and that parent perspective of how do we design systems so that we are encompassing it around their experience versus them having to learn new systems, cultures, supports at levels as they matriculate through the system. So a lot of our work is around this developmentally appropriate practice. Now, this particular legislation focused on the principal preparation programs, which you have a captive audience, like Christy said. But we do a lot of work as well on the around professional development for school leaders. And I put two of our sites right here. You know, it's the Pre-K-3 Teach Lead Grow website and the B3 Continuity Project. We kept finding when we were offering experiences to principals, they had so many competing interests that we wouldn't get good attendance. So we've been tying developmentally appropriate practice lessons around the things that they need support in, and one of them is teacher evaluation. So we did a validation of the Danielson framework for early childhood teachers, and have designed a whole website that has videos of quality early learning experiences around the Danielson domains. And so if you can meet them where they're at and where their attention span is, but thread in this broader systems perspective, we have found that really effective.
Great, thank you, Erica. Gracie and Jean, you want to talk a little bit about your theory of change?
Sure. So the main driving force on our theory of change was to give the leaders in these schools what they needed to really lead high quality, robust early learning communities. It's based on the 3 pillars of leadership, assessment, and instruction. But what we found was many times these principals were coming from a higher ed background or from a coaching perspective, which we really love that disposition in someone, but they just did not know what was it to lead this high quality early learning continuum in their school setting. Not only did they not know what they were looking for, we had to help them know this is developmentally appropriate, but not just that, it's the more important concept was how do you lead these teachers and give them what they need to be successful in this space. I think the other part of the theory of change that we were hoping to do was we have this unique situation that we are partnered, we're the Department of Early Childhood Education, then we've partnered with this outside agency that's CLASS, and then we've partnered with this national organization of NAESP. So the hope was to bring this cohesive program together that had these multi-lens effect to really develop leadership in this space. Gracie, would you like to add anything to that?
Thank you, Jeannie. Yes, at NAESP, our goal is always to provide our principals with the knowledge that they need to lead successful professional learning communities. And what we were finding as we were looking at research is that a lot of the effort, especially in early childhood principals, it was more self-taught. And so looking at providing a leadership academy that was based on competencies that principals needed to know to be able to do and lead this quality work of early childhood in their buildings, it just came to the forefront for NAESP, and that's precipitated the designing of the academy and reaching out to have partnerships with states. And I know that Jeannie and I will talk a little bit more about that as we go along in this session. In the session previously, we heard in California how they were finding that their principals did not have the knowledge and skills to be able to put a pre-K through 3rd grade continuum in place in their buildings. And so looking at what NAESP could do on a national level was very exciting for us, and then our partnerships, not only with state associations and departments of education, but with the P3 Center to base our knowledge and advice to principals on the most current research has been very important to us.
Great, thank you, Gracie. Mike and Bobby, I'm going to jump to you next to talk about Minnesota's theory of change.
Thank you. One more back on that, Christy. Okay, thank you. So from the start, we really had a capacity building approach to our work. Looking back, I think we really lucked out with having Christy and Jerry Wiest as our first P3 speakers in the state. That started to build momentum, and then in 2013-14 school year, Christy was back in Minnesota for a leadership institute. I think at that time we didn't have a model or theory with our work, guiding our work. I think we also kind of relied too much on national experts. We started to hear feedback that folks were wanting to apply Minnesota principles, and then we're really wondering, like, what would the work look like in Minnesota? So we sat down, we spent a lot of time working on a model that would guide the delivery, design and delivery of our professional development, which is up on the screen now, and everyone will notice those pillars there from implementation science. So we had leadership, adult competencies, and organizational or system. So our approach, and we started in 2015 with a principal leadership series that was based on those NAESP competencies that came out. So it was just perfect timing for us. And then we were able to, just as another example, we worked with the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. They designed an online course that really looked at teacher competency, but it also had an administrator track to that. And then the other component was the organization or system. And then another example of good timing, Michael Fullen and Joanne Quinn came out with their book on coherence, which seemed to be just a perfect match for P3 work. So we were fortunate with Race to the Top and grant money to be able to deliver those, but also had the challenge at hand, and how do we develop capacity internally at the Department of Ed to further our professional development on these areas. I think our model has evolved also over time. So one of the things as we got deeper into the work that we noticed is we didn't have anything that really applied to system change in the work. And a couple of years ago, FSG came out with their Water Systems of Change publication, which fit really well into what we wanted to do in Minnesota, and fit perfectly with alignment. So even in areas of policies and practices where there's clear misalignment. So it seems every year, right, that we would get complaints about a child being suspended from preschool. And as it turns out that, of course, that would never happen to a kindergartner. But it's one of those examples where these policies and practices are misaligned between early childhood and K-12, and people often aren't aware of them until we have the opportunity to dig into it. And another component of that was mental models. So we've definitely evolved in the last couple of years. We're very explicit about kind of what are some of these mindsets that slow down our work and what needs to change for people to advance in their P3 work. With that being said, we do have a theory of change. And that's on the next slide. So this isn't as well developed. And we were able to work on this at the Colorado Institute a couple years ago. Our big advantage is we have cross-sector from our Department of Health, Department of Ed, Department of Human Services, as well as childcare, our Head Start Association. So we have a lot of key players in Minnesota. But that's also been one of the challenges, is getting everybody together to complete our theory of change in a coherent, effective manner.
Great, thank you, Mike. I do not have slides, but I want to quickly articulate some of the theory of change from the higher ed side. One of our theories of getting from a leadership program to actual instructional change, one of them is this notion of adult learning. And as has been raised a little bit, is that we know that sit and get one-time workshops don't work. You really need sustained leadership development, which I think is one of the impetuses behind all of our work. But by having a credit-bearing academic program, we had a real stick to ensure that our participants stayed with us for an entire 10 months. They couldn't just come and go or attend one session and then not come to the next session. By making it an academic program and credit-bearing, attendance mattered. And so we really had a dedicated 10-month course of study for our participants. So that was one key design feature. Was ensuring that we kept people for the entire time so that they got the full leadership experience. The second part of our theory of change that really is important is that throughout the course of study, we engaged our participants in an action research project. So while they were sitting in class, they were learning strategies that we then expected them to be implementing back at home in their schools and in collaboration with their community partners. And the action research project was scaffolded across the full 10-month course of study so that they first might be helping to create a shared vision across partners. And then they would be coming up with a problem of practice that they were working on together. So that by the end of the 10-month course of study, they had not just learned new things, but they had practiced enacting those things in their real life context. And so that was a key part of our theory of change, is that we didn't just want to give them new information, we wanted them to be doing something with the new information. Okay, now we're going to move to the third question, which is about scale. I think these are some of the most challenging questions in this P3 work. Is we have pockets of excellence in a lot of places around the country. But I would like to hear from each of you now about how are you thinking about scale? And are you reaching enough principals and administrators that you believe children's learning opportunities are actually changing at a scale that is important, both for children's learning and then for having statewide influence, since these are all statewide programs? Jean and Gracie, I have you up first for this question.
Jean, do you want to start and talk about your state efforts?
Sure. So this was one of my favorite questions to think about. When we think about scaling in Alabama, from the very beginning, it had that built in because it was open to the entire state. So if you applied for the P3 pilot, you did have to apply to the academy, but it was also open to other leaders in the state. And so automatically from the beginning, it had that concept in mind. But it's also been something that I've been challenged. We're going to talk later about the P3 task force we have. And the actual Vic Wilson, who's over class, he looked at me one day and he said, you know, you've got to really think about leadership. When these leaderships start taking some changes within the schools, do you have that built in? And we've already seen some of that happening. And so we have realized that it's got to expand just beyond what we think about as far as a principal. So now we're encouraging counselors and the assistant principals and instructional coaches and people from the Department of Ed that just might be in the central office layer. We even have P3 coaches that are applying. So opening those doors up to other leaders in the school, a little bit beyond the principal, has really been something that we've worked on as well. And I think it's been very needed when we think about not only scalability, but it'll speak later to sustainability. So the scalability is there as far as moving through the state within the school system. What we've not thought really well about is how can this be scaled as far as the 0 to 5 world. And we are thinking about that leadership academy now. And so I know we talked about this, Chrissy, before, but so we've taken the model that we have, which has worked really well, and we're now trying to apply that in that 0 to that child care space and that early care space from 0 to 5. But if I had to say if there was a disadvantage, that would be the disadvantage we have, is that it's scalable within school systems. It's scalable even, we have a very diverse delivery system in the P3 pilot. So it's even reached out to charter schools and faith-based, which we've let in to this, to class for NAESP. But when we think about a disadvantage, that would be a disadvantage if you go this route. The advantage is it's gone across the state, but it's not really reached that 0 to 5 community unless you use this as a model to look at, to build upon.
And I would just add that from NAESP's perspective, I mean, we feel great about the work that we've done and the partnerships we've had with states like Alabama and Nebraska, and there have been other states where we have held cohorts, but it's getting the word out there that we have a great model and academy in place. And then part of our charge is to keep our research current. And that's why this fall we'll be coming out with a refreshed look at our Leading Learning's community guide, and it will be a principal's guide for early learning and the early grades, really focusing on the work of principals leading that pre-K through 3rd grade continuum. And but I'll talk a little bit more about the way that we run our academy, but we have had a lot of success in the states where we've been in partnership.
Great, thank you, Gracie. Bobby and Mike, I am going to go to you next to talk about this issue of scale.
Okay, I can start us off on this one. So on the screen are a couple images of the state of Minnesota. And of course, with our P3 work and then any professional development, one of the challenges is always, regardless of the topic, been statewide reach. Our Minneapolis-St. Paul metro areas, not centrally located, so access can be a bit of a challenge to those in greater Minnesota. So in the map on the left is how Minnesota is organized by what's called the Governor's Economic Development Regions. So one of the things that we did right away with our work was to try to develop capacity in each of those regions. So we target each region from the start with our first professional development offering, P3. We have a physical map that we maintain that charts every district and what they've participated in and who's participated. So we're able to monitor that and to know where we need to increase our outreach efforts. The map on the right is an example of a digital map that we used when we were implementing voluntary pre-kindergarten in Minnesota. There's 330 school districts, 170 charter districts. So it becomes, it can become pretty cumbersome. But I wanted to use that as just an illustration to show that we do track. And I think, of course, with P3 work, just like at the district and community level, balancing breadth and depth has been one of our big challenges. I think as we've advanced in our work, so recently we've been able to do both. So we've been able to do some offerings that we do that could be first timers that we're just trying to get reach throughout the state. And then last year with PDG funds, we were able to do what we called regional collaboratives. So we were able to use some funds, grants for districts of $25,000 where they could take that money and work on specific P3 initiatives regionally. And we would require the district, for example, to collaborate on professional development. So they'd have to invite not only their local partners, but also another district from their region so that they would get used to learning and working on P3 together. And Bobby, I don't know if you want to add.
Just quickly, just an internal strategy that is really a strong priority for me is to really shift the adult behavior within the Department of Ed and really work so across all the divisions that engage with schools, take on a joint ownership and a joint responsibility for this work. So really working within MDE to build that common understanding, that common terminology, and make it a priority for every division, because it doesn't do much good if early learning services is the only division prioritizing this when you have your regional centers out there talking about something different. So one of my goals in the role I'm in now is to really build internally and get those adult behaviors and beliefs all on the same page, going down the same path for prioritizing P3.
Great, thank you, Bobby. That was actually an issue that came up in the last session around some of the state level challenges as well. So thank you for reiterating that. Erica, do you want to talk a little bit about sort of how the legislative approach gets to scale or not?
Yeah, so our approach by doing it by legislation was statewide. And so by statute, all of the programs, the principal preparation programs had to pause their programs by a certain date and reapply for approval. And so if they didn't get approved, then they were no longer allowed to operate. That did shut down a couple programs, but most of the state programs did an extensive redesign. It wasn't just tweaking, it was really overhauling their programs. And we did a lot of education. This was driven by both our Board of Higher Ed and our state board, which was really powerful because you had the two agencies together. And we did a lot of training among the center of our licensure board and what to look for in the redesign work and redesign programs. And the state boards also put together kind of an intermediary group that reviewed programs before they went to the licensure board for approval. So there was a lot of education. And we've also supported in implementation. We've had a couple of grants in our center to do technical assistance with universities in the redesign and specifically around the B3 work and helping them to integrate the early childhood, the special ed, and the ELL content. And we've created some toolkits from that. But the challenge is our work is, this work's based on the district as consumer. The universities are responding more to more pressing priorities of the districts, and districts still are coming along with their prioritization of early learning into their systems. And so we've had a couple of evaluations. One was done 2 years after our redesign work, looking at how did the implementation go. And one of their findings was the early learning piece still is not as strong as it could be in these programs. They've got to integrate it into the content and the candidates have to do the experiences, but the universities are not going outside of their partnering districts to make those placements. And so if their partnering district doesn't have an early learning program, they're struggling. They're not reaching out to Head Start or childcare centers. They're not engaging with family and parents and advocacy groups. So they're not getting that full, rich experience that they could be doing. More recently, I put on this resource here, Abby Lieberman from New America did a report on preparing principals for pre-K in Illinois. And so this is a very recent review of how the work is going in Illinois, years after our reforms, and it's showing a mixed bag as well. Some groups, some universities are doing a better job than others, and some are, just doing enough to follow the legislation. Some not as much at all, and our state board is not, doing that auditing of that piece. So, it's kind of flying under the radar.
Great, thanks, Erica. And that's actually a good point to land on, just to respond from a higher ed program perspective, is that that is actually one of the biggest challenges of having a program led from a single IHE is the splintered nature of IHEs and the regional nature in most states. So for example, my university might be the prominent provider of higher ed in a particular region of the state, but we're not as accessible to other parts of the state. And so that makes the scalability function a little challenging, especially if there's a large in-person requirement, which there is. We have not been fully online to date. So I do think an IHE approach does have that limitation. I think another limitation from a scale perspective is that to have an IHE do it, and in order to grant credit, you have to charge tuition. And even if we can negotiate a lower tuition rate, the cost of the program to enrollees can be a barrier to scale. And so I think this is something we have not answered as a whole group. That might come up in Q&A as sort of what is the cost to participants. But so for example, the program that I ran out of University of Washington had a tuition rate of around $3,000 per person. For principals, at least in the pre-COVID time, that was often doable because they had professional development dollars from their school district. I do believe there's some concern as we move into the economic impacts of the pandemic that some of those PD funds will be cut at the district level and or state level. And so I think this whole cost to participants is an important issue to consider as a scaling question, and that as other states think about designing programs, really thinking about what is the right approach and how will it, what will the financial impact be on potential enrollees. All right, we're running just a little bit behind time, but I do want to get to the last two questions, and I'm going to lump them together. So if you can answer the last two questions together so that we have time for Q&A, which is around sustainability. Like, what is the future of your program? And who are your key partners in this? And those actually might be nicely intertwined questions anyway. And I am going to start with Minnesota again to bring these two together. So sustainability and partnerships. Bobby or Mike?
Okay, so sustainability, you know, we've been pretty fortunate. It's not a huge sum of money, but we were able to secure an annual bucket of money from our Title II funds. So we've been using that the last couple of years to kind of sustain our efforts. We are also looking at every legislative proposal that moves forward and seeing how and where we can embed P3 language in those proposals and across other divisions as well. We're also looking at, we're in the process of revising the Department of Ed's strategic plan and in alignment with our governor's One Minnesota plan, and it's very focused on 0 to 8. So that's an opportunity to build it into policy. So even though our funding isn't huge, we have other ways of building it into a more permanent structure in Minnesota. Mike?
Yeah, and I was here looking at the third bullet and thinking like that I should have added in here with our partners because it's not MDE doing it by ourselves. And we were lucky, very lucky. I think a pivot for us was in 2014, MESPA, our Minnesota Elementary School Principals Association, actually created a P3 design team. That was comprised of several principals, and we met with them over a number of months to work on professional development, as well as to talk about the role. What is the role of principals, not only in early childhood, but potentially in P3 as well. And we meet with MESPA every year several times to talk about what we're working on or to plan for future events. So we're very, very fortunate there. In our principal leadership series, I think this was a big lesson for us. We used principals as facilitators, so MDE staff was in the background. So I think one of the big benefits there was the instant buy-in from other principals who were participating. And I know MESPA had as one of their guiding principles that professional development for principals by principals. So that worked well. It also worked well with their regional leaders because they were able to tap into that as a resource. Another example from that, a big lesson learned for us with our online course, we used regional liaisons. We called them their essentially like teaching assistants in the course, where they communicated with the University of North Carolina staff about the course. And there was, I think we had 12, and it was a mix of principals and early childhood folks. And one of their tasks too, even before the course started, was to recruit participants. And one of the interesting things is that the early childhood folks had a very hard time recruiting elementary teachers into the course, where the principals had no problem with that. So we had a little discrepancy between the regions and how many early childhood and elementary teachers and staff were able to participate. But overall, they've been really critical to our work. And we're also progressing into taking what we've done and building online professional learning modules that will be easier to sustain. And as well, going back to our capacity building efforts, we're going to utilize those P3 regional collaboratives to create narratives and videos on some of the work that they've done that will align with the P3 framework buckets. And then lastly, one of the key things that's been great is how P3 elements have been built into legislation. And the 3 bullets under that are just examples from one of the programs, our voluntary pre-K, taken from there. So it's built into almost all of the requirements, but you can see from transitions, not only requiring cross-sector work with that, but also going vertical as children transition into kindergarten. Also with curriculum and assessment, that's been an effort. And then lastly, with family engagement as another one, which also includes another program unique to Minnesota, early childhood family education, which is a underutilized parenting education program in Minnesota that's in every district. And that can go up to 3rd grade if the district has a P3 initiative. So it not only helps us align, but it gives districts an incentive to develop initiatives and better work with families up to 3rd grade.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Erica, you want to talk about sustainability?
Yeah, so first I'll talk about partners. Our work was all about partnership. And we even counted at one point, we had over 800 people involved in the construction of this. It was really a bottom-up reform. And but key partners in this were the unions, districts, universities, higher ed, the business community, parents, large districts. CPS was very instrumental in this, and legislators as well as special interest groups. So those were just to name a few, but the one group we didn't have involved that I think is hurt in implementation and sustainability is we didn't have HR directors. And so when you're talking about a certification change, we had to get them up to speed later. And so there was actually some kind of pause with implementation of posting and the expectations for leaders under the old requirements and not seeing this broader purpose. So I just kind of pointed out.
HR directors in school districts.
Yeah, yeah. So, and they have a statewide association. So we really started now all of our work, we're really making them very involved with it. You're just making the assumption that superintendents are talking to their HR directors, but they weren't. And so the implementation, the sustainability of our work, I mean, it's sustained, and it's been sustained through 3 governors now, 3 different state superintendents, executive directors at IBHE. We had a 2-year budget impasse in Illinois, and it survived that. Although that did do a big hit to our principal preparation programs. But we do worry about what COVID is going to bring about, because we have some key levers that are the standardization, the quality controls. And one of that is the internship that's designed around the competencies. And if our candidates can't get in the schools, if they can't experience early childhood in that sense, and so we're afraid of what this is going to mean. And I'm also afraid, I mean, universities, I think one of the biggest challenges is they don't invest enough resources into teacher and principal preparation programs as they should. Many do, and those are the national leaders in that, but many do try to do it on the cheap. And so when they're going to be pinched for their resources, that's going to trickle down to this. And so that whole higher ed component of having presidents and provosts and deans understand the value of this and the need for this work is just as important as ever now, so that they continue to invest the right resources in this work.
Great, thanks, Erica. Gracie and Jeannie, do you want to talk about Alabama's and NAESP's sustainability and partners in this?
So as far as sustainability goes on our side, one area that was key was funding. And so, of course, we write it into our PDG grant and a renewal, but also on a larger scale was as we started this with the P3 pilot, which has now kind of outlived the pilot phase, which was built on that Kellogg seed money that we had, we did move it into the legislator position, and Governor Kay Ivey put it as part of her Strong Start and Strong Finish. And so that really helped us leverage some funds from the legislators to keep this program going, which is also keeping the Leadership Academy going as well. And so I also think part of the sustainability is the fact that we have this multi-layer approach, that it's the state agency partner with this association, partner on a national level, which gets the traction out there, gets the interest out there, and keeps it going in and of itself. So as part of sustainability, you do have to look at your funding, but you also have to look at how is the word getting out that you even have this academy. And so Gracie, do you want to pick up? Oh, and I'm going to let Gracie talk about this, but the approach of NAESP let us go into this pandemic pretty well and let the program go. So I'm going to let her speak to that.
Thank you, Jeannie. Yes, we have been fortunate to be written into some of State Department's PDG development grants. And we do have the Academy put into a structure that did make a pretty seamless transition when we were hit by all the challenges with COVID, because we've always had the Academy in a blended learning model. It's built around a cohort of 25 people that are selected by their State Departments of Education, looking at principals in that state. And so those 25 people come together. We had a combination of 3 face-to-face meetings with them and 2 online courses that are now put into our LMS Canvas. So we were able to make those face-to-face meetings virtual, although it's not ideal. We were able to do that pretty quickly with the Alabama cohort that was going through. So we have a great blended learning model. We're updating our research. And then a big piece of this is that we also have advisors that are working with the participants in the Academy. And we have monthly meetings with the advisors who in turn are meeting with the participants in the Academy and keeping their coursework on track. And then a big part of the work in the course is to choose one of the 6 competencies and plan a capstone project so a principal can actually be doing authentic work while they're working through the Academy coursework, because their graduation will showcase their capstone project.
And if I could just add, I think another really key part that's led to the success of this is who the mentors have been. The mentors we have now actually have been those who have been through the Academy, and they applied to be mentors. And so some are principals, it works over in our department as far as she's a retired superintendent, she's in P3. So I think the mentors have been huge as part of that sustainability and scalability as well. So
Great, thanks. We have just about 10 minutes left, and we have one question that's come in through the chat box, which is, so you all have already talked about your own intentionality. What strategies would you recommend to states who are just starting this process or even wanting to build the intentionality with legislators or other state policymakers? So what's your best advice to the 35 some states that haven't really taken on a prominent effort on this yet? Who wants to jump in first on this one? Bobby, good.
I think I would form a close partnership and relationship with your state elementary school principals association executive director and their leadership team, because that's going to give you an avenue into all the regions of your state. And I would also think about, like in Minnesota, as I'm sure you're all aware of, we just have a huge achievement gap. And so we are trying to tie it to support our 3rd grade reading initiative. And our social emotional learning work. So maybe tie it to 1 or 2 key areas and not try to do the whole gamut of alignment to start with.
Thanks, Bobby. And I also want to just re-emphasize, I think Minnesota is fairly unique in this, is the value of tapping into some of your Title II funding. I think building it into sort of already existing funding streams is a really smart strategy from my perspective. Erica or Jeannie?
Yeah, if I could say something, I just want to say one of my key takeaways is the work that Bobby mentioned in hers, how you're looking at different legislation going through right now and looking at where that P3 lens could be in that. And so I think tying to existing things that are happening or in development and seeing where those bridges can be made can help with like trying to set that vision in the state of a systems approach, and including that systems approach in areas that you'll have the attention of the folks that you need. And so I think that would just be a good starting point, and then from there seeing if there's gaps along the way with that. But I mean, that's what happened with our principal prep work in Illinois, is the early learning folks came to us and said, you know, this needs to be broader. And so they were able to tag into that and help us create a bigger vision. And I think you're able to kill multiple stones with that.
Great.
I think the only thing I would add, Christy, is, and this probably seems so easy to say, but I think the partnership with what you do at the P3 Center has been huge and beneficial to me and what we do in Alabama. Because I think about when you came and spoke and the people in the room, how that spread beyond that room, and the partnerships that we have on this call. Like, I take away things and I bring it back and I put it in place and spread the word, and probably the key partnerships that you build. Like I said, we didn't keep it just with the early childhood education. We reached out to association, and now we've developed a P3 task force. So the sooner you can get other people champion and the voice for you, those other stakeholders take that message with them. So that would be my suggestion. Gracie, would you have anything to add on that as you've been in Alabama?
Well, I would just agree, because sometimes we talk so much about being a professional learning community, but then we're all kind of doing our own thing instead of taking the best of what we all do and putting it together to go forward. So all the advice that everybody shared would be helpful in moving forward with your pre-K through 3rd grade work.
Great. Another question that I think is coming up increasingly, thanks in large part to the pandemic, is the connections between elementary schools and community-based childcare, other early care and education programs, Head Start. So I wonder if you could each reflect a bit on how your P3 leadership work is including and or collaborating with the birth to 5 or early care and education sector.
Well, I'll go ahead and go first, because I was the one who mentioned that this model what we do doesn't really touch that. But it's really given us a great sense of urgency within our department to get something in that space, because we've seen the difference it has made in our K through 12, you know, that elementary space here. And it's really just energized us. Like, we're on a fast track to make sure we do come in with some sort of leadership, something, academy, something designed for them. We know it is huge. We know the difference it's made. So if anything, we're taking what we've learned and we're turning backwards to say, wow, that it's needed. We've got to do this, especially now. You know, so you think, why now? Especially now. We now see why this group, if nothing else, they have peers that they have formed in this cohort. They talk to each other. They're figuring this out together because of the cohorts they're put in. We need that in childcare. We need that same networking going on so that they can be together. So if anything, it's really charged us with a sense of urgency. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but that's where we are. So
not specific with our work in Illinois, but Illinois, through the Illinois Network of Childcare Resource and Referral Agencies, does the Gateways grant, and it's competency-based and it's leveled. I mean, it's a great model, and we're often referring to it as a model for articulation all through the system of degree attainment. And so there is leadership in that. So I don't know if they work as closely or if they're taking lessons from the principal prep, but I know in our policy work in the center, we're always taking lessons from that and trying to bridge that into higher ed. And I think it was actually Gateways which kind of inspired our principal prep programs to have the standards-based internship. So I think there's just lots of connections. If you bring people together from these systems, you'll learn. And so a lot of it's just bringing all those directors and leaders from these different programs and systems together and start to see where that overlap in those lessons and that commonality is, and not always seeing silos and differences.
Christy, NAESP also has a strong partnership with Head Start. So we're constantly in conversations about how we can support the work with each other.
Great.
And
yeah, I would just add quickly that the partnerships and relationships that have been and were established through Race to the Top and preschool development grant work across the agency has really been a huge value add in our COVID response, because through the governor's office, he put like 4 to 5 task groups together. And so these folks that are on these task groups are used to working together because of previous initiatives. So it was kind of it's just been an ongoing partnership because of the relationships already established with the child care folks and the resource and referral and Head Start. Great.
And I'll add an example, couple examples. One is that we've always required team participation in our P3 work. So districts, of course, have to bring early childhood, a K-12, and then a community partner. And that's always, the community partners have varied, but mostly Head Start or child care provider. The other thing with our regional collaboratives, last year, we decided to contract not only with the district, but with a tribal Head Start. So that way there wasn't any conflicts over the money. So they were each able to work on things they wanted to work on, but also work together. And then we were able to work with both and were able to facilitate those relationships. So I think it was a good learning experience for us and for them.
Great. And I would add that the P3 leadership program that I've been talking about throughout this presentation at University of Washington, although I have focused on the engagement of elementary school principals, the program itself was actually designed to enroll both birth to 5 administrators and elementary school principals. We had a 50-50 enrollment. And so we had principals literally learning side by side with their community-based partners. And the action research projects that we talked about were done in collaboration, because we really felt that we needed to break down the silos that exist even before the professional learning opportunities. So we designed a leadership program that brought them together. There were pros and cons to that in terms of power differentials and sort of, knowledge background. And but the program itself, we designed to engage both sides of administrators. But I do think that this is an ongoing challenge in the pandemic, is to break down these barriers between childcare and early education. And it's, I think, an opportunity for all of us to deepen and extend our work. We are now getting close to time, so I want to express my gratitude to all of the presenters, Bobby and Mike and Gracie and Jeannie and Erica. Really appreciate all the hard work you're doing, especially right now, and especially carving out the time for this presentation. I know you all have probably 9,321 other priorities around school reentry and planning, but we appreciate your wisdom and your work in this area. So Matt, I will turn it back over to you to wrap us up.
Thanks, Christy. And I just want to echo your sentiments. It's been a great conference, a great session. So just on behalf of Education Commission of the States, Council of Chief State School Officers, National Governors Association, and the National P3 Center, we just want to thank you for your time. We know you're all incredibly busy. So CCSSO will be following up with resources from the event. And please know that you can reach out to us collectively for help. We're here to support you in your tremendously important jobs right now. So please stay safe, and we hope to see you soon on another event. Thank you.